Jerome, thanks ever so. And as Jerome mentioned, a very warm welcome this afternoon for this happy hour. As we say, this is about housing with pride, and it coincides with Pride Month. And I'm delighted to be joined by a really excellent panel, some of whom have spoken at previous Housing Lin events in person. But over the last year or so, we've had to move these all online. And the happy hour sessions have been more or less with us now for a year. I think last week was our anniversary, and I'm really delighted that we've got 5 excellent speakers. Andrew King, who's Professor of Sociology at the University of Surrey, who many of you will know has written extensively around different aspects around housing, issues around LGBTQ plus communities, and various guides and tools as well. And so delighted, Andy, that you can join us. Long-term friends of the Lin from TONIC and One Housing, Anna and Martin. And this session is very much about putting the spotlight on the developments in London and the plans in place for affirming retirement community in central London. Some of you will know this, and I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag where it is, but really exciting programme there. And then we also put the spotlight on Manchester as well, and the work that's been undertaken behind the scenes with the LGBT Foundation and Anchor Hanover. And we're joined by Bob and Charles, again, long-term supporters and friends of the Housing Lin. So we've got an excellent session for you. The idea is that each of them will talk for 10 minutes or so, and we will then pull together Q&A from the chat box and the Q&A boxes, and have a general roundtable discussion thereafter, and hope to finish around 5:15 or thereabouts. So hold on and let's take off. So Andy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I'll just share my screen. And hopefully you can all see that.
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, it's great to be here today on such a great panel as well. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a Professor of Sociology at the University of Surrey. I've been researching ageing amongst LGBTQ plus people for around about 15 years. And over the last 5 years or so, I've become more and more interested in issues around housing. Housing amongst older LGBT people, but also housing more generally. The title, Not Just a Niche Thing to Do, is really some of the things that I've experienced over the last 5 years, where people think that housing in LGBTQ plus communities is quite a niche issue. It isn't, it's much broader, and I'm going to explain why. And also, I think particularly when some of the new schemes were launching or being discussed, there was a perception that these were just very niche kind of schemes and that there wasn't a very big need for them. And I think that needs challenging as well. So I'm going to talk about 5 projects that I've been involved with over the last 4.5 years or so. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk in detail about all of them. And when you get the slides, I've hyperlinked these reports so you can actually go and have a look at these in much more detail. But they cover a range of issues. So some of them are to do with older LGBTQ plus people's experiences of housing. The No Place Like Home study was about LGBTQ plus people living in social housing. The pledge scheme was something we developed with House Proud as a result of that, and followed that up with a project called Housing with Pride. And Building Safe Choices, I was a consultant on this excellent project from TONIC Housing, Stonewall Housing and Opening Doors London, which was about the need and demand for LGBTQ plus housing and around housing issues in London. So really, my 2 aims today are to just briefly introduce some of the research findings, and then to give you a bit of an overview of how we've used that research to inform policy and practice. So I'm going to start with the first study that we did, which we called Safe Housing, Secure, Accessible, Friendly, Equal Housing. When we started this study in 2016, there wasn't very much empirical evidence about the needs, concerns and experiences and preferences of older LGBTQ+ people around housing. I think it had been about 20 years since the last study in the UK. And particularly, we wanted to find out what those experiences were, but also to think about what type of housing people would like in the future. And like all the studies that I'm going to talk about, it was a mixed methods study where we used a survey and then did focus groups and interviews. So one of the issues that really came to the fore was about safety and comfort at home and trust in other people in and around LGBTQ+ people's homes. So whilst the majority of participants who answered the survey, there are 175 of them, felt safe in their own home, it was very much dependent on the amount of control that they felt they had over their home environment. The more control they felt they had, the more safe they felt. Trans respondents were particularly concerned about safety in their neighbourhood, with transphobia and transphobic hate crime being the main issues of concern. But we also asked people how they felt about different groups of people coming into their home, particularly as this was an older group of people, thinking about people who might come in to give support later in life in some way or another. And as you can see from that graph there, most of the respondents to the survey felt comfortable about all those different groups, but less so around those providing home or domiciliary care. And also, people felt that with increasing frailty or poor health or reduced mobility, they would become more vulnerable and feel less safe in their home. And as one person said, I'd feel less likely to be able to defend my corner against discrimination that I might experience. So the other thing that we were interested in are sort of wider social networks and community and connections, as well as the role of care in later life amongst the people that we surveyed and spoke to. And the graph there, we asked people whether they felt part of a wider LGBT community. I think there's often a perception, I might say misperception, that everybody who's LGBTQ+ feels connected to some bigger community. And certainly what we found was that that was fairly mixed. And as you can see, 21% of survey respondents didn't feel part of a community at all. And one of the things that came through the study was about this concern about social isolation. And this worked in several ways, one of which was about who people could turn to if they needed support. And whilst the majority of participants did feel they had somebody to turn to for emotional support and practical help, 18% of survey participants didn't feel that they had anyone they could rely on at all. The majority of cisgender, lesbian and bisexual women respondents to the survey expressed a preference for a carer, if they had to have a carer, as the same gender as them. And the majority of cisgender, gay and bisexual men expressed a preference for a carer with the same sexuality as them. And trans respondents were just generally very concerned about care and discrimination that they might experience from care providers. So we also asked questions about housing in the future. If the majority of the participants were owner-occupiers living in their own home, they hadn't really made any plans to move. They hadn't really thought very much about plans for the future and what would happen if things changed. They did express a concern about mainstream housing for older people, particularly that they might experience discrimination from other residents in those communities or from staff. And this was particularly the case when they were asked questions about housing with care. And again, there was a preference for more LGBT specific types of housing with care in those instances. The trans people who participated in the survey and the focus group were more divided about this and were concerned about transphobia in LGBTQ plus specific housing as well as mainstream housing. And we asked respondents what they thought about the possibility of an accreditation scheme to identify LGBTQ plus inclusive organisations, whether that would be housing organisations or care provider organisations. And 3/4 of those in the survey felt that was a good idea. And many of these issues, and in fact more, were sort of built on in the Building Safe Choices study from 2020, which focused on the need and demand for LGBT housing and housing services later in life in London. And there were particular needs around accessibility and wanting to maintain connections with LGBT plus friends and communities. 75% of the, I think it was 624 people who took part in the survey, wanted to stay in London and wanted to, keep their social networks in and around London. 56% wanted LGBT plus specific affirmative housing provision, and also a significant number wanted LGBT specific affirmative care provision as well, and around about a quarter wanted an accredited care provider. So I mentioned that we also did a study specifically about social housing residents, and that's because we didn't get very many social housing residents taking part in our first study, and also we felt that there was a real need, and we were approached by Houseproud, which is the staff network for LGBTQ plus people working in social housing, to undertake this study, which became known as the No Place Like Home study. And again, as you can see here, similar issues were identified. So again, issues around safety in neighbourhood, although people felt they lived in a generally safe neighbourhood, around about 1/3 of the survey respondents didn't feel that their neighbourhood was a safe place for LGBTQ plus people. That rose to 60% for trans respondents. Similarly, there were concerns about who might come into their home, with particular concerns about landlords coming into the home or repairs people coming into the home. And 1/5 of the gay men that responded to the survey said that they modified their home in some way to hide kind of evidence or clues to their sexual orientation. Many of the respondents were sort of ambivalent, really, about how well housing providers deal with issues of harassment. 1/3 thinking that they dealt well with it. 1/3 were sort of, unsure, and 1/3 didn't feel that housing providers did deal with it very well. And again, 3/4 of the survey respondents thought that some form of accreditation scheme was needed, particularly one that emphasised staff training around LGBT lives and issues. So the key messages from the research really are LGBTQ plus people need choices that ensure their safety, dignity and their social connections, both now and in the future. But I also want to emphasise briefly that diversity and intersectionality are important, and not something I've been able to go into detail today. But I think it's really important for everyone to remember that not all people want the same thing. There's wide diversity in the LGBTQ plus communities, and not all people have the same options, whether that's to do with money or other factors. So what to do with this research evidence? Well, Houseproud decided that they really wanted to do something with the study that we did, and also there was a kind of groundswell of sort of opinion in the social housing sector that something needed to be done. And so we followed that up, those sort of projects up, by developing something that's now become known as the House Proud pledge scheme, which I'll just very, very briefly talk about. So it was developed through a series of consultation with senior housing executives, frontline staff, and LGBTQ+ residents. We had a steering group which represented many housing providers and LGBT organisations, including TONIC Housing, Stonewall Housing. A lot of support from the Greater London Authority as well. And we developed this sort of equality framework for housing providers to engage with their LGBTQ+ residents. And it became known as the Pledge Scheme, and it's got two levels, Pledge Pioneer status and Pledge Plus status, which I'll talk about in a moment. We launched the scheme in May 2019, and the first social housing providers signed up in June 2019. So the core commitment, so when a housing provider signs up to the pledge scheme, they commit to beginning on these core commitments within the first year of signing up. One is about resident voice, ensuring that residents can input at strategic level through a series of consultations. One is to address that issue about training and education for staff, so a comprehensive programme of staff training. And the other is about visibility. So when somebody makes contact with that housing provider, they know that they belong to this scheme, and more importantly, that they are LGBTQ+ inclusive, and that they take LGBT inclusivity seriously. Providers can also engage with their residents to undertake Pledge Plus, which is the kind of next level of accreditation. That's usually undertaking small projects around resident identified issues. So once we'd launched the scheme, we then secured funding from the Economic and Social Research Council via the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence to undertake a project called Housing with Pride, which ran from May 2019 to February 2020. And this was to kind of raise awareness about LGBTQ+ issues in the sector, and also to support those organisations that had signed the pledge scheme. And we undertook a whole series of activities, including creating an animation video to communicate the findings of the research. And I wrote a blog, and there's a final report which brings everything together. We've since secured more funding from the Economic and Social Research Council to undertake the next stage of this, and to really build collaborations in the sector to really, sort of emphasise the importance of LGBTQ+ inclusivity in social housing. So there's a little still from the video and some of the workshop activities. And one of the things that we recommended in our report was that engagement with LGBTQ+ residents needs to be ongoing. It needs to be supportive. It needs to be regular, purposeful, and enabling as well. It shouldn't be a one-off tick box sort of exercise. Despite the pandemic, the House Proud were able to do a sort of audit and progress report of the pledge scheme, which found that 31 providers had expressed an interest or signed up, 16 were underway, 7 in 2020 had achieved Pledge Pioneer status, and 2, Clarion Housing and Anchor Hanover, had achieved Pledge Plus status, and the report is on the House Proud website. In total, we think that the pledge scheme now reaches around about over 1 million social housing residents. So to go back to my point about not just a niche thing to do, I don't need to tell this audience, I'm sure, that housing is much more than bricks and mortar. It's about people's identities and safety, and also about their social networks and connections. For LGBTQ plus people, housing's a pivotal issue, especially in later life. I think it goes more and more up people's agenda in terms of what they need to think about as they get older. There's a moral, legal and customer service imperative on the part of housing providers to act. And I truly believe this isn't an issue that's going to go away. In fact, I think it's going to increase. That's why I'm delighted that we're going to hear about the 2 schemes that are being launched and developed. Thank you very much.
Andy, thanks ever so for setting that out so comprehensively, but also clearly. And I think you've given really both the sort of chronology of the development in terms of some of the real useful resources that you've pulled together. And I very much want to sort of hear what our friends from London and Manchester are going to talk about first, because I think you raise a number of key points that both reflect on perhaps some of the lack of choices that have been around, but also where this can be is both a mainstream, but also something which is very much around creating affirmative communities as well. So, you know, trying to get that balance, and that pledge is something I'd encourage all people who joined us this afternoon to sign up to as well, to raise both not just the numbers game, but also the quality of what our commitments are. So thanks ever so much, and we'll come back to you. I note that we haven't got any questions at the moment, but I'm really interested personally on some issues around those links with care that you raised, as well as other issues that come back to people's different experiences of coming out over the years and how that has had an impact on their housing choices. So it may be something that Anna, Martin, Bob and Charles might refer to in their presentation as well. But for now, a big thanks, and I'm delighted to welcome Anna Keir and Martin de Mello from TONIC Housing and One Housing, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you, Andy, as well, for that really good introduction in terms of the background of the issues. My name's Anna. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really proud to be the Chief Exec of TONIC Housing. We're based in London, and I'm also co-chair of House Proud. I think first of all, it might be useful if I give you a bit of background about TONIC, in case you've not heard about us. So TONIC is a small community-led not-for-profit housing association. It's run by and for older LGBT people. Our focus is on creating vibrant and inclusive urban LGBT affirming retirement communities, and this is really about creating a place where people can share their common experiences, find mutual support and enjoy their later life. TONIC was set up in 2014. Specifically to address the issues of loneliness and isolation that many older LGBT people face, and to respond to their demand for community-specific housing and support, as Andy has explained. So TONIC's really all about community. Given the absence that many older LGBT people have of a lack of family support, having this choice in older persons housing is really important. We use the strapline at TONIC, this is how we live our lives out. And it is a play on words, but it is actually about being a place where you can be yourself, you can be authentic, and you know, you can be your out LGBT self in your later life and not have to go back into the closet, which is sadly all too often the stories that we hear from people when they feel like they have to face those choices about their later life accommodation, where they don't feel they can maybe live their full lives. So that's really essentially what TONIC's about. We focused initially on our provision in London to meet this demand. We know that London is a very challenging housing market, but the capital has the largest LGBT population in the UK, roughly 145,000 people over the age of 55 identify as LGBT in the capital. It's a place where people came to across the country to find community and have stayed. And we felt very much that we needed to respond to what the community wanted and where they wanted to be. We've used a term in our title called, the UK's first LGBT plus affirming retirement community. And I thought it might be useful just to explain what that means. So TONIC essentially believes that our services and support shouldn't just be LGBT friendly, but they should be genuinely affirming of the lives, histories, needs and desires of LGBT people. And to make it really clear, that term doesn't imply exclusion of those who don't identify as LGBT+. It's much more about actively valuing those who respect and celebrate LGBT people. I've got here as an example that on our website, we've got a couple of short film clips, and they really do tell the stories far better than I can. And I'm just going to quote Vito here. She said, "I think my ideal circumstances would be to live in a housing scheme that depicts my culture, values my culture. A lot of people don't understand what that culture is, but I don't have to define it when I'm with other LGBT+ people because it's just understood." And I think for me, that really captures it. Because we know it's different. Living in a retirement community is what it says on the tin. It is a community. It is about the other people that are there. That's what makes the community come alive. TONIC has a diverse community panel of people with lived experience who actually, along with our board, have shaped what TONIC looks like. So when we use that term community-led, it's real. This is what we do. And it means that we make sure when we're developing and thinking about meeting that demand, it comes from the people who actually want that housing. Now, to kind of take that forward, TONIC actually has developed a partnership business model, and that was really created from the reality of not being able to access the significant capital investment that's required to build housing with care at scale. And particularly in central London. And you know, for our board and our community panel, they really wanted to do this completely themselves, but I had to kind of come in. We worked together in terms of that reality check of that. We also learned from colleagues over in the States. There's an amazing organisation called SAGE in the US, and there are 17 LGBT affirming retirement schemes across different states in the US. And SAGE advocates on behalf of those different organisations who provide those. And they very much, they use the partnership model over there. They use it slightly different to us. They've got a tax credit system that we don't here, but the principles of it are very similar. And so we kind of learned from that approach. And what we specifically learn is actually getting the right provider and partner to work with is really important, because you're in this for the long term. This isn't a kind of short-term provision. It's a long-term arrangement when you're looking at people making their housing choices. And what we did then is we took that and went out and talked to lots of different people, lots of different housing providers to see what our options might be. And One Housing came to us through actually our membership of ARCO, the Associated Retirement Community Operators, and told us about their Bankhouse scheme in Vauxhall. For us, I was excited about the start of that conversation. Martin, who you're going to meet in a minute, was, very enthusiastic about it, but it was also about where the scheme was. It's in Vauxhall. It's, we'd spent a lot of time talking about that the location was really important for the first TONIC scheme. It had to be somewhere that our community members felt like was right for them and was home for them and was a safe space. So I was really excited about it. And my first visit actually to Bankhouse was in 2019. And I was a bit like, a school kid, or, I had a shopping list, and it wasn't my shopping list. It was the shopping list that all our community panel and board members had put together for us, saying, right, for our first scheme, these are all the things we want. and I literally walked around Bankhouse. Interestingly, I bumped into Jeremy. And he was like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Then in that scheme, and it was a really good experience, a really good moment that I could actually take from that and said, actually, 95% of what TONIC would have done anyway is actually in this scheme. And that was, that was kind of a pivotal moment for us. Obviously, that was a long time ago, so we've kind of been building the partnerships as we go. And for us, the partnership model is now an advantage. It's about bringing the best of each organisation together. We have bought and been working with One Housing in terms of bringing LGBT awareness training in for all the staff at Bankhouse. We've also done that more widely across the business as well. And we're going to keep that going. That's going to be, a feature of part of the long-term partnership. But just before I hand over to Martin, I did also want to highlight one of the key elements about this partnership and about TONIC. The reason TONIC's a housing association is that we're aiming to create a community asset and perpetuity. We're not looking just to be a service provider. We have to give our customers, our residents, that confidence that we're going to be in there in the long term. And that really, for me, is what makes the relationship really important with One Housing. It is about having common values, but it's also understanding that that's what TONIC needed from this relationship. So we're actually going to be owning some of the properties in Bankhouse, and we will actually be a landlord ourselves for our customers. But it's very much, we've been working together not to create a them and us culture. We're working that the whole scheme is LGBT affirming. The offer that we bring is for One Housing Group customers and TONIC customers. It's very much about working together on that, and we have been doing that with current residents. So I've probably said enough. I'm going to hand over to Martin now, and he can tell you his side of the partnership story.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everyone. So just a bit of background on myself. My name is Martin de Mello. I'm the Exec Director for Care and Supports at One Housing. I've been here about 14 years, but I've been in the care and support kind of environment arena for about 33 years. One Housing, for those who don't know, they're quite a large London South East based provider, members of the G15, and actually the largest membership within G15 with substantial care and support. So there's quite a few with care and support, but we're the largest provider of care and support within G15. Our main three areas that we cover within care and support are senior living with and without care, mental health and learning disability schemes and services, and also homelessness. So that gives you a bit of background there. So just going to really cover about the building itself at Bankhouse. So Bankhouse is basically one of three tower blocks, modern tower blocks in Vauxhall on the Thames side, known as the Corniche, but our single block is called Bankhouse. It's designed by Sir Norman Foster and his team. So One Housing won't take the plaudits for that fabulous design. It wasn't us. However, we did design the floating roof garden and roof terrace along with all the interior with PRP and One Housing's internal design team. So we have 17 floors, 84 apartments, and it's a complete mix of rented extra care on the lower levels. We have some leaseholders with and without care, and we have some dedicated units to Lambeth for with and without care for rented. And we have the upper floors, which are now with our partner TONIC, and that's their own units, as Anna said. It's quite a unique design in many ways. You don't really see too many new tower blocks going up of this sort. We were very lucky, let's say, on this. We worked with Lambeth and the GLA quite early on this project, which was obviously a St James building, who owned by Barclay Homes. We'd already done an extra care scheme, retirement scheme in Oxfordshire with St James. So we looked at this as another option, and Lambeth are very keen on the Section 106, which is going to be one of the blocks as being affordable retirement housing. So that as in all deals, takes a long time. But what we did arrange on this, which is again unusual in a 106 agreement, is that we would take control of a lot of the interior design, which to us was key in the deal. It's very much aspirational living. It's very much a premium product for the affordable market. For those who haven't been, you can see the floating roof garden in this picture, which is actually linked. It looks like it's linked to both towers, but it's not. It's solely for use at Bankhouse only. And we have an equivalent size roof terrace as well with fantastic views. It's part of what we call our season scheme. So we've got extra care. I think everyone in retirement housing does elements of extra care at different levels. But what we wanted to do is create more of a premium brand for the affordable market. So within this and within all season schemes, we have an aquarium. Lots of people ask why we do aquariums and living walls. The reason is that we looked at some studies, especially in America and Europe, when we did some of the HAPPI tours, etc., in design. And aquariums go down very well, especially with dementia customers, and obviously families and children. We want to welcome families, grandchildren, etc., into schemes, and this is one of the ways we've been able to do that. We have a bar and dining room, restaurant area, as in all schemes, and a private dining area for families, etc. It's slightly different design to most buildings that we do in extra care and retirement living, in that the whole of one floor is a through lounge. We do have some separate spaces, but actually it's one through lounge with quiet lounge, more active lounge, restaurant, and then bar area. I think the key thing here is this is a product that we're very proud of. I think I met Anna, as I said, in 2019 to look at this scheme. I think it ticked boxes for the partnership and what we wanted to achieve. We'd already worked with Lambeth on, the fact that there's a very large LGBTQ plus community within the Lambeth area, and specifically within the Vauxhall area. So this was always very much open, as is, to referrals from that community. And actually, when we started speaking to Anna, I think around a quarter of our customers were from the LGBTQ community, and a number of staff. So we were very much, it worked for us. I think it's taken a long time. Anna's done tremendous work with the GLA. Anna and myself met with Lambeth Council very early on, and they were very open to this partnership and looking at this scheme in a way it's transformed to become an LGBTQ affirmative service. And so that went really smoothly. I think one of the things we recognised together early on is, and Anna touched on this, was training and understanding. So one of the things we did well over a year ago, but we've done it again very recently, is we talked to all the customers, existing customers and staff, and consulted with them on what the service was going to be. And we had a brilliant response from everyone. And then Anna and other services we've used have done LGBTQ training with our managers, not just in Bankhouse, I should say. We've done training across all of our care and support services, and that's a continual rolling programme. I think the big thing for us is we feel very strongly about this scheme. We love it. We love the partnership. We think it's going to be a great success. And my main thing I'd like to say is, we'd really like to do more of these. And I think we'd like to do some from scratch. As Anna said, there was a reason for the way we approached this particular scheme, but it did tick all the boxes for TONIC, and I think that's clear. And I think anyone who wants to visit this service will see how great it really is. But we are in talks with TONIC and others, and we would like to develop more LGBTQ plus community schemes and services, not just in retirement living, but we would like to look at homelessness and mental health as well for those services. That's it from me. Thank you.
Anna and Martin, thanks ever so for a really interesting presentation, both in terms of the relationships that you've developed to co-produce and co-develop this development and make use of a really great location, great scheme and great services. And as Anna said, we did meet there by chance. What you may not be aware is that the scheme itself is bang next door to where the Housing England used to have its London annual conference as well. So we're very familiar with it in both its geography and location, as well as the quality of care and support it offers to residents in the council there. I know we've had a couple of questions that have been raised. Can I just remind people to put those in the Q&A box? I think Laura, you put it into the chat room, but please do put it into the Q&A box. Well, we've had a look at some of the exciting plans for London. We're now joined by Bob and Charles, who are going to talk from a Manchester perspective. So Bob, can I introduce you and Charles as well? So I think Bob, you're going to go first.
That's right. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you for inviting us to give us the chance to talk about the Manchester LGBT extra care scheme. I'm so proud to be able to talk about this, especially it's Pride Month, but it's also Loneliness Awareness Week. And that's exactly what the scheme's about. It's to celebrate LGBT people's identity, but it's also to tackle our isolation and the loneliness which has come to a head during the COVID pandemic. So proud to talk about it today because we've been talking about this for decades, for a very long time. And that's what I want to touch on today. Talk about the past, talk about the present, touching a little bit about the reason why we're doing it, and then the future. And that leads very nicely into the headliner for today. And that's Charles, who will talk a bit about the Anchor Hanover role in the Manchester LGBT extra care scheme. If I press the right button, we'll go into just a little bit about the LGBT Foundation, who I'm working with on the scheme. So they've been around since the 70s, and they provide support to about 4,000 people a year on their telephone helpline and through to face-to-face work. And gosh, I think 600,000 people contacting online. So a lot of people that they're helping with. Housing and homelessness is becoming a major issue for people contacting LGBT Foundation. And in fact, during the pandemic, the number of people or the number of housing calls has went up by 88%. So it's becoming a big issue. And thankfully, we're starting to talk about housing and how we can deal with housing issues, predominantly for LGBT older people in the first case. So we started talking LGBT Foundation and Stonewall Housing Awards, started talking to Manchester City Council back in 2016. And these are just a snapshot of some of the press that we've had around the scheme since then. We did also 2 scoping workshops with LGBT people to talk about the idea of an extra care scheme. But this is, and I'm trying to get this across during what I speak about, is it's not just LGBT Foundation, Manchester City Council, but we're standing on the work done previously. Polari is an LGBT charity that have been talking about LGBT older people's issues back in the 80s and 90s. Homes England, actually, when their equality board in 2014 started to do some research in Manchester. And they started to do some market testing and they identified some locations. So that sort of laid the groundwork for Manchester City Council. So in 2017, Manchester City Council announced the scheme, the idea of the scheme. And in 2018, in the middle slide there, middle image, they identified a location, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a little while. And then in 2019, TONIC, Anna helped LGBT Foundation, and we were successful in getting some community housing fund from Homes England, which was great. So that in 2020, we started to do some community engagement work. We started to do, we did a survey, and we did set up a community steering group. I think what the most exciting thing in 2020 was that Manchester City Council, despite COVID pandemic, they were still 100% committed to the scheme. And that's why, you know, Guardian identified it as a game changer, because, you know, Manchester City Council decided that it was something that they wanted to include within their extra care strategy. Why did they want to do it? Well, it really came out through the survey and through the focus groups that we've been doing. They're very clear. People were going, these were comments that were actually given to me. People were going spare with the loneliness. People had to soldier on through harassment that they were receiving from neighbours. And one quote, which I'll read out verbatim, one person who responded to the survey said that she would rather be dead than the living death of heteronormative old people's homes, places that she had worked in previously. And as touched on before by Andy, I mean, this is where older LGBT people are having to live. And the survey made very clear that actually people want a place where they can celebrate their identity and actually have shared space with their family. And that's who we are, our family. It all really came across as well through the survey that people wanted autonomy. They didn't want their vulnerabilities sped up. They wanted also community, not isolation. They didn't want a gated community. They didn't want a ghetto. They want community to come into the scheme. And also very clear that they wanted more certainty about where they were living. You can see the reports on the LGBT Foundation website. But one thing was very clear, that there was a call out for LGBT community spaces within the scheme. And especially, you know, I think it was about 58% of people want LGBT community services within the scheme. That number was much higher. For trans people, it was 75%. And for Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, it was 82%. So there's a real cry out for that engagement with our communities within the extra care scheme, which is great because it helps us frame what we're wanting to build. So on the image on the left, that's the old Spire Hospital that Manchester City Council purchased the site, and they did some pre-planning application consultation events around the demolition. It's in Whalley Range in Manchester, which has got a really strong local LGBT presence. They have events for LGBT people there. They've also got a great support from local communities, and the engagement or consultation exercises that they did, there was a very overwhelming support for the idea of an LGBT extra care scheme in Whalley Range. So we've started a community steering group, and the community steering group meets at the moment every couple of weeks to talk about different issues. And we've had the pleasure and privilege of having Jeremy along to one of the sessions to talk about the HAPPI principles. So we've been talking about also dementia-friendly design. Also talking a couple of sessions, we talked about safety. People are very nervous at the moment, following from some of the press releases, some of the comments on Twitter and on the Manchester Evening News website. We're very homophobic, biphobic and transphobic. People are quite nervous still in 2021. So it's how do we ensure that safety in these locations? How do we ensure that we work with local community groups that people feel safe living there and visiting there? But also we're starting now to talk about design, which is great. We're talking with architects about what design means. And, you know, just even thinking about what's quite, let's talk about it in America more than in the UK, about queer design, queer architecture. You know, what does that mean? How do LGBT people design their spaces when quite often in the 80s and 90s, we've had to meet behind boarded up windows? What does it look like now? If now we can design our spaces, what will they look like? And that's what's exciting about the future. We're now talking about what we're going to have in the scheme. We're talking about operational issues, and we've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go. And it's great that we have partners like Manchester City Council. We've got older LGBT people, we've got older people from Whalley Range on our community steering group. We've got this learning journal on the LGBT Foundation website, and we're adding to it so that we'll grow through the years as we learn different things, which we'll hopefully be able to share with different groups. Feel free, have a look at it, share your comments. to my email. Nice comments, please. And also mailing list, join the mailing list and we'll let you know the latest about the scheme. But there are other schemes, and that's what's great to hear about TONIC, what's happening in London. There's also Leeds, Pride of Place Leeds. There's a London older lesbian co-housing. There's lots of things going on, which is exciting. Unfortunately, we've lost so many of our older generation who have never seen these schemes come to fruition. But it's great now that these schemes are happening. And for Manchester, great that we're co-producing it with Anchor Hanover. And that's where I hand over to Charles.
Thank you very much, Bob. Good handover there. And thanks very much, Jeremy. I'll let, while Jerome pulls the thing, thanks very much for the invite, Jeremy and Jerome. Really great to join us today and hear the, Andrew's insight, hear more about where TONIC and One Housing Group are getting to. And really good to hear Martin talking about homelessness and other services for the LGBT plus community as well, outside of the traditional area that I normally talk about. That's positive, isn't it? I'll try and keep it brief, Jeremy, because I think I'd rather get to the Q&A, absolutely honest with you. So I'll run through this. My name's Charles Taylor. I'm the head of new business for Anchor Hanover. My role is the acquisition of land, delivery of land. I've got a team behind me, a lot of them on this call today. But of course, also I'm relying really heavily upon my colleagues and external agents who support me in this process. Next slide, please. I won't go into detail about who we are, but Anchor Hanover, hopefully you've heard of us. We are both organisations from the 1960s. We set up, we merged back in late 2018. And part of our merger were about being a greater voice for the sector, because we're still finding that we need to make more challenge to government and to in planning authorities, for example, about increasing the supply of older persons housing, as well as advocacy, etc. To have more opportunity for colleagues, make some efficiency savings and more homes growth, more homes for older people. And that's my function. Next slide, please. We're a registered social landlord, community benefit society, we're CQC registered. We're also a very large care home provider as well. Next slide, please. We're going to rattle through these. We have our values. These are accountable, respectful, courageous, and honest. These slides will be available after if you need a reminder. Obviously, also a lot of information available on our website, or contact me. Next slide, please. So I think let's get to the nub of the matter, which is why we're Anchor Hanover keen to be a partner with Manchester City Council and Manchester LGBTF in developing this scheme. Well, there's a lot of stuff we've done in the past. Andrew talked earlier about House Proud, and we're very proud that we are Pledge Plus status along with Clarion. We're a member of the Inclusive Employers and Stonewall Diversity Champion. We were one of the 6 housing associations, funded the 2017 Home Safe Research, which Andrew also mentioned. So you can see a lot of synchronicity in there. We've got a really strong resident LGBT plus group, and I'm really proud to say a colleague rainbow network for all my colleagues. But a lot of the driver, the information and the intel that we received was from our experience of a development called New Larchwood in Brighton. So next slide, please. Now, New Larchwood in Brighton was a pilot project. Maybe our Cressida's on the call, who's been really involved with this. And she may be wincing at this point, but it felt like it was a tryout in 2018 by Legacy Hanover, looking at creating an affirmative development. So they took a sheltered housing scheme in Brighton, and we piloted an LGBT plus inclusion at a housing scheme level. As it says in there, the aim was to develop a scheme, look to be LGBT inclusive and not exclusive, and that's coming across from everybody talking today, isn't it? The aim is seeing an increase in the proportion of LGBT plus people living in the scheme. We chose Brighton and Hove because of the high proportion of LGBT plus people living in the city, but also, importantly, and I think these are the things that both Anna and Bob have talked about, and Andrew, the reputation of being trans-friendly and inclusive. Next slide, please. So how did we do this? Well, we looked at, these are some of the details. We looked at providing abuse and awareness training to colleagues and on-site partners. We were very open in the scheme and marketing leaflet of data about how we were open to LGBT plus residents. We had a really strong position in terms of complaints, antisocial behaviour, and our EDI statement of intent. We would, for example, have a nurse practitioner who came for an on-site surgery for a specialist training around hormone treatment for trans people, for example. We were very open about the health information for LGBT plus community. Next slide, please. But the outcomes, this is where we started to get this assessment and look, this is all building on all this research, don't forget. It's not just on its own, this isn't acting in silo. The percentage of residents who are able to identify, Anna's point about being community, being comfortable in your own skin, identifying as LGBT plus at New Larchwood doubled. So that's a real gain, isn't it? That's a real win. That's building on this example, isn't it, from practice? The increase in well-being for all residents, including the LGBT plus community. We established clear connections with the LGBT plus organisations, and there was very positive media coverage. Next slide, please. So looking at all that, taking into account when the opportunity to tender for this opportunity came out, and as I'll repeat to anybody, ordinarily, we don't bid for land, we don't bid for opportunities. This is the first one, and we were successful. So it's 100% success rate, and I'm really pleased on that. We were really keen on it because of this whole build-up. But I'm going to pick on Andrew's point of it's not just I nearly said it myself, Andrew, not just a niche thing to do. This is about changing, trying to be part of that more influence and trying to change. So we're looking at the moment, working with Bob and Manchester City Council on a proposal for a mixed tenure development. It's a circa 100 apartments. And for anybody on the call who's experienced at developing extra care, it's an extra care scheme in all but intent. However, there will be changes to that. So we're looking at the moment at an attractive building that's set in gardens. Whalley Range itself is a really attractive, nice area. Bob was saying it's fairly, it's one of those communities where there are a high percentage of members from the LGBT plus community. It's well located, it's a sustainable position for access to transport and amenity. It's an area that people would want to move to, I think is the target for that. At the moment, we're working through with the community steering group and with Manchester, trying to get to that pace to trying to reach an agreement for lease by the end of 2021, trying to bring that forward as we can. Planning application early next year, making a start on site by the end of 22. And I think we should be looking at first residents moving in early 25. Next slide, please. This is the nub of it for me. What's the difference and what's the same and what's different to a typical Anchor Hanover development? Bearing in mind at the moment, I've got a pipeline. I can't remember how many schemes we've got on site. We've got a large pipeline of growth. We're targeting 73 new developments over the next 10 years. We've acquired 12 sites in the last 12 months. So we're very experienced in developing extra care, later living retirement communities. So what's the differential? Well, it's still about the same thing. It's still being a welcoming and safe environment. It's still being part of the community. These are really identical critical parts, and that's where we're talking and engaging with the community steering group. It's thinking about affordability. My colleagues on this call will all know that's I always bang on about how much it costs not only to build, to buy, to live there. That's critical. Taking into account the LGBTF research into incomes for the community as well. We're very, very mindful of that. It's outward facing, not hidden, reflecting some of the conversations that Bob and I have had. And we're learning from the research, looking at the outcomes from the House Proud research, looking from the LGBT Foundation and from our experience in New Larchwood. So what's different to an usual Anchor Hanover development? Well, in this case, we're doing on a co-produced basis, working with the LGBT Foundation and Manchester City Council. But I'm also going to come back to Andrew's point again. This is not just about bricks and mortar. This is really critical that we get to the place where we have a vehicle to provide good quality operational policies and procedures that enable people to take part and live in their home, able to be themselves. So I'm going to leave it at that, Jeremy, and open the section up for the Q&A, if that's okay. So a bit of a whistle-stop run through, and apologise for that. Thank you.
Charles, thanks ever so. And that, again, a really great presentation from you and Bob, setting out the context. And what you may not know is that I administered the Department of Health grant, which resulted in New Larchwood. So I was really pleased to see that and how you've taken that on board there. Since the merger as well, because at that time the grant went to Hanover. Again, some really excellent comments, contributions from both of you, and Bob, also you mentioned other sort of projects that you're involved in, and we're really pleased that your colleagues could give evidence to the all-party parliamentary group research on dementia with your project Bring Dementia Out as well. So some really sort of pioneering work yourselves are doing it in other fields in relation to housing for people in later life from the community. We've got about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and I know we've got 2 questions already that have come in from Rebecca and Laura. Thanks ever so. I'm going to come to those in a minute, but can I also give a plug for anybody who hasn't put any questions in yet? We've still got a few minutes to do so, and please do feel free to direct those at either an individual or for the general discussion that will take place. But what I'm going to start off with is Rebecca's question. Welcome, Rebecca, from Erosh, long-term friend and supporter of the Lynn and vice versa. And you've asked, we came across a housing provider not in London who developed an LGBTQ plus sheltered and retirement scheme. Because they didn't attract sufficient older people, they opened it to non-LGBTQ plus older people, therefore resulted in a non-LGBTQ plus affirming scheme. So merits of specialist housing for old people versus freely living in one's chosen life, better support in mainstream housing, or is there a role for both? Andy, you hinted at some of this in your opening presentation, then I'll ask others to contribute too.
I do believe that there is a role for both, but what I really do believe in is that all housing for older people has got to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. I'm sure everybody feels this as well, because even though it's fantastic, the schemes in Manchester, in London, in Brighton, there will, first of all, we can't have, it's unlikely we're going to get one in every town and city. And secondly, some people don't want to live in those sort of communities anyway. And so therefore, we've got to make sure that all housing for older people is LGBTQ plus affirmative.
Thanks. And Anna or Martin or...
Yeah, I'd love to just add to that, because I completely support what Andy says. And, you know, we work in this space that is about choice, although, you know, obviously TONIC is specialising in a type of provision within that choice, because there's virtually none of that around at the moment. I'd be really interested to know what that scheme is, by the way, maybe offline, because, you know, we're really interested in kind of histories and what other things are going on. But my answer to the question, I think, or when I read that question, I thought, actually, one, you know, I'm talking at other events because there's lots going on with Pride, and one of those for Property Week that I'm talking about is the title is "Build It and They Will Come," and actually TONIC's the complete opposite of that, and as I think also the work that is being done in Manchester is the opposite of that. It actually comes from the basis of the community, so it's actually understanding what the community want as your starting point and then shaping your provision around that, and that's so important. So I don't think it's an issue about the demand is there, but if you just think you can build it and stick a flag on it, that's not going to work. So that would be my kind of initial reaction in terms of, you know, that situation. And hopefully everyone on this event today has kind of presented that. We're trying to very much all come from a community-led perspective on this.
Martin, Bob or Charles, any comments from...
I totally agree with Anna. I think we've looked at the research, a lot of it which TONIC provided when we spoke to Lambeth. And the numbers are there, the need is there, there's no doubt about that. But so I think it is about understanding the community, shaping the provision in the right way, and actually shaping the provision and the service with the community, with the LGBT community, because I think that's the way to get it working. But we see this across a number of different projects, not just these services. It's if you haven't really gauged the service and work with the wider community, they don't always work.
I'll just come in there. Absolutely, Martin and Anna, absolutely right. I mean, it's very reflective also of the non-LGBT plus community. If you don't base it upon what people need, you can't then sit back and think, why is anyone coming through the door? So you're absolutely right, Anna. You need to push back on that, build it and they will come. No, understand your customer first and foremost. Design it, build it, operate it, manage it to that purpose, and then it should be successful. But yeah, that's a bit worrying to think that, isn't it?
So the next question is from Laura, who I think is from the Retirement Housing Group, and she asks, how was Bankhouse funded? Was it all from sales, or were grant or subsidised loans made available? And she says, yes, it does look fabulous. So absolutely fabulous. So that's probably to Martin originally, and then Anna as well.
Yeah, I mean, as with all this type of provision, especially with Section 106s, it's a mishmash. So we got quite considerable grant from the GLA for this, but the grant was mainly for the rented affordable housing and not necessarily for the leasehold. So we have a mix of some income from the leasehold sale, some with obviously our transaction and partnership with TONIC, but the majority was actually from our development subsidy, which we put into most affordable and social housing. So effectively, I think 2/3 of the cost was covered by One Housing in terms of debt finance.
And then I'm happy to pick up on the TONIC element of that, because we've obviously recently put out the announcement that we were granted loan funding from the Greater London Authority. It's actually from the Community Housing Fund. It is a loan for a period of 2 years. So it's a short-term loan, and what we're actually purchasing from One Housing it is 19 of those leasehold properties. So we will then be reselling those on a shared ownership basis to our customers, and the capital receipts from which we then pay off the loan back to the GLA. So it's quite a neat transaction. We do, we have modelled this financially on being able to sell the lowest possible shares at 25%. And if we do that, we will need a long-term loan, which I'll give a bit of a shout out to our friends at Charity Bank, because without them saying that they would actually consider doing long-term loan funding, none of this would have been able to happen. So the GLA wouldn't have just done the short-term element of it. So again, a community-led a bank that's supporting what we do has been really important in that provision. And like many of the kind of older personal shared ownership schemes, the purchase price is limited to, you can't buy more than 75% share. This helps with the affordability because we don't charge rent on that final 25%, but it's also that 25% that TONIC will own in perpetuity, so that we will manage future sales, and we will obviously, that will be marketed primarily to our customer base and keeping it LGBT affirming in perpetuity.
So that's really interesting, and I think what I would really like to ask you personally is, do you think that's the type of model that could work in other developments, nationally, and not just specific to Bankhouse?
Absolutely, it is. It's been really good working with One Housing on developing that model of how it operates, because we think it is replicable. TONIC's actually applying to be a registered provider in our own right, so on future schemes we would have the flexibility of also being able to provide rented housing, but it's a flexible partnership model, so it's about working in specific locations, what's needed in that locality, the partner that we work with, and developing it that way. So yeah, definitely replicable, and that's what we hope to do.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and very much on the capital side. And I'm sure, Martin, on the revenue side, you've got both planned care and purchased care going in as well. So that again helps it stack up for those people who may need additional care and support. And indeed, I think, Anna, on the day that I visited, would you believe it, I think that evening was gin and tonic evening, because on a monthly basis, and this makes a link to our happy hour, there is a really enjoyable session with residents to really build a community and to celebrate living there as well. So I'm sure there'll be several of those in months and years ahead. So thanks ever so much, and I think Rebecca's put up supplementary question in saying that she will think about, well, she can't quite remember the name of the authority, but I'm sure if that does come to mind, she will share that with us. I was going to ask a question, and I hinted at this, Andy, earlier, about whether through your research that you've been able to sort of look at the lived experiences of people who have perhaps come out and are coming out now in later life, who for many years have experienced discrimination, and particularly around their housing.
Yes, I mean,
while you didn't touch on it explicitly, I just wondered whether there's something you could share with your research and academic sort of background on that.
I think, yeah, there's several things really, Jeremy. I think, first of all, we shouldn't assume that somebody who identifies as LGBTQ+ later in life has always identified in that way throughout their life, and they will have they will be experiencing, they could well be experiencing their later life quite differently from LGBTQ plus people who did come out earlier in life. You know, I think there's again, there's a bit of a sort of conception that LGBTQ plus people, particularly older lesbian gay people, don't have children. Some do, but not as much as, not as many maybe as the sort of heterosexual majority. So I think all in all, I would say that people's experiences of later life, including LGBTQ plus people's experiences of later, are shaped by what's happened to them throughout their life. That might well have involved quite a lot of discrimination, stigma, shame that they will carry with them. And I pick up the point that I think both Bob and Anna raised earlier on. If people are then going into a housing context, that in a sense triggers all that off for them again after they fought very hard to deal with that, especially later in life. That's a terrible thing for somebody to have to go through. It's terrible for anybody to go through, but it's terrible for that person to go through. And I think that's why when I say it's more than bricks and mortar, that's kind of the sorts of things that I'm getting at, really. The experiential side of what it means to be in your home and whether you feel safe in that home, not just safe from attack, but safe in yourself, really.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, again, I think what you've highlighted there is both some of the sort of prejudices out there, but also how we need to be much more inclusive as well as a society. And again, that's something we very much advocate through the LIN. I'm conscious we're coming up to our final couple of minutes, and I just want to go around the panel, see if there are any final comments that any of you want to make before I bring our happy hour to a close. Charles,
don't mind kicking off.
Anna, please kick off.
I was going to say, well, I was going to thank you actually, because it's really nice that you've hosted this and the opportunity to bring us all together. I think so often it might look in the media like there's all these different projects going on and they're not connected. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. So I work very closely with Andy, I work very closely with Bob, as well as working with Martin. I think it's fantastic that, you know, we're now, you know, that collective energy, we're now actually starting to make some real change in this area. And I see it as a bit like a snowball that, you know, once people can see it and understand it better, then, you know, that will actually really make the change and there'll be the demand to do more.
Well, Anna, I was going to say you clearly are playing a game whereby you have to add different cocktails into a conversation, because I believe a snowball is also a cocktail. So any other comments and any ways of adding a cocktail into your response? Very appreciated. If not, I'm going to...
Lost your words on that one, Jeremy.
Yeah,
but I think in terms of, you know, it's been really interesting conversation. I appreciate we're at the starting road, although our time with we've only been in 6 months with the project with LGBT Foundation in Manchester, but appreciate they've been looking at it for many, many years. So I think it's going to be an interesting road ahead. But as Anna said, you know, these are about, I refer to ripples. These are about changes. And I think the more positivity we have about this, but get back to that point, we have got 550,000, I think it is, sheltered units and extra care units across the country. Jeremy, that's where the change needs to be, as much as building brand new schemes, which is all very nice and safe, but a lot of people are living out in the community. But so yeah, looking forward to the road ahead, and look forward to come back at some point to talk about where we're getting to with the Manchester scheme. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Charles. Look forward to following that up with you and Bob. Martin, Bob, any final comments?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying it'd be really good to have a touch on this in the future, see where we're going on these projects, what the progress is and what new projects are coming out. That's really, really positive. And again, thanks for the invite and thanks for everyone who's attended. And the cocktail event is run by a group called Cocktails in Care Homes, and they're fantastic. We do quite a lot of them, and I tend to attend most of them. You can probably guess why. So thanks a lot.
Well, I know you're great care as well, Martin. So, and Bob, final word to you.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, back to Rebecca's question, I mean, and these schemes will help celebrate LGBT identity and keep us safe, but it's all schemes, we need to be upping their game. And I think that's great about Manchester City Council. They're investing in this scheme, but also then piloting their accreditation across the city. So it'll raise the game for everyone. So I think coming back again and seeing how far we've raised the game, that'll be really good. A challenge to us all.
Bob, can I just throw in there? Sorry, Jeremy, very quickly. And of course, Pride in Practice, Bob, once more, which is about accreditation for care providers, because I think the comment we've all made is about accreditation. We've got housing providers on here, but also care providers. I think that's an interesting concept as well.
Yeah, no, Charles, that's a really good point. And again, it touches on what Andy was saying in his opening slides, where he showed that sort of affirmative care experience and wanting an agency that has that as well. And I hope we can come back to that in the longer run as well. Look, this has been a really wonderful session. Thanks ever so much, all five of you, for your contributions. Can also thank Jerome and Sally behind the scenes for sort of fielding questions and typing things into the chat box. If you found this of interest, the slides and the recording of this will be available shortly, and we'll be notifying you of that availability in due course. Please do also offer your feedback to this session. There'll be an opportunity for you to comment. Bob talked about this week being Loneliness Awareness Week. You may not know it's also Learning Disability Awareness Week as well. And on that theme, one of our future happy hours will be looking specifically on issues relating to housing choices for people with a learning disability. I think that's on the 6th of July. More immediately, next week's session will be with Motion Spot and the Centre for Ageing Better, where we're looking exclusively at more contemporary styled adaptations and home modifications, looking both at the work of Motion Spot and the Extra Care Charitable Trust, but also thinking about some of the work that's coming through the Centre for Ageing Better's The Good Homes Inquiry as well, which will look at that both in terms of adaptations of our home, but also the use of technology in our home as well. So if you haven't already signed up to our upcoming happy hours, do have a look on our website. We're really look forward to welcoming you all back again next week, and thanks again to all our contributors this afternoon for a really wonderful session. And I do hope you can try and grab a cocktail sometime shortly. Okay, bye for now.